12 years. That's how long I've been living alone in that cabin, tucked away in the mountains where nobody bothers to go. I came up here to get away from everything, from the memories that followed me everywhere else. But some sounds, some cries, they follow you no matter how far you run. I am fearful to even say this story to the world, but Bigfoot exists. And I saved 2 infants of their species. I nurtured them to health during one of the worst storms I had ever seen. Then something amazing happened that changed my perspective on life, forever. The cabin sits about 8 miles up an old logging road that barely counts as passable anymore. No neighbors for miles in any direction, just me, the woods, and whatever wildlife calls these mountains home. I know every sound out here by now. The way the wind moves through different trees, how snow slides off the metal roof, the scratching of raccoons trying to get into my garbage. After 12 years, nothing surprises me anymore. Until that storm hit. It started on a Tuesday in late January, what the weather radio called a historic blizzard system. I'd seen plenty of bad storms up here, but this one felt different from the start. The wind came from directions that didn't make sense, howling like something alive and angry. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction, and it just kept coming. Day after day after day. By the 3rd day, the power lines finally gave up. I wasn't worried. The wood stove keeps the cabin warm, and I keep enough supplies stocked to last months if I need to. The silence after the electricity died felt almost peaceful at first. Just me, the fire, and the endless sound of wind and snow. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the storm playing tricks. Wind through the trees can sound like almost anything if you listen long enough. But this was different. It came in waves, rising and falling, almost like crying. Not quite human, but not animal either. Something in between that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was just my mind playing games, the way isolation can mess with your head. But it kept coming back, cutting through the storm noise like a knife. High-pitched, desperate, the kind of sound that reaches into your chest and squeezes. The sound was coming from somewhere near my woodshed, maybe 50 yards from the main cabin. I knew I shouldn't go out there. Visibility was near 0, and the temperature had dropped to something that could kill you in minutes if you got lost. But that crying wouldn't stop. It got under my skin, reminded me of things I'd spent 12 years trying to forget. I bundled up in every layer I owned, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into what felt like the end of the world. The wind hit me like a physical force, driving snow so hard it felt like being sandblasted. I could barely see my own feet, had to feel my way along the cabin wall and then follow the fence line toward the shed. The crying got louder as I got closer, more desperate. Definitely coming from behind the woodshed, in that little sheltered space where I sometimes find deer bedding down during bad weather. I rounded the corner of the shed and nearly dropped my flashlight. 2 small shapes huddled against the wooden wall, barely visible under a coating of ice and snow. At first glance, I thought they might be bear cubs that had gotten separated from their mother. But as I got closer, something about them seemed wrong. The proportions weren't right. The way they moved, the sounds they made. They were about the size of human toddlers covered in dark fur that was matted with ice. Their faces were more human than animal, but not quite either. Flat noses, prominent brows, eyes that seemed too knowing for wild creatures. One was barely moving, just shallow breathing that sent tiny puffs of vapor into the frozen air. The other was making those crying sounds, soft whimpers that seemed to be calling for help. I crouched there in the storm for what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't any animals I'd ever encountered, but they were clearly dying, freezing to death, while I stood there trying to figure out what they were. the decision made itself. I couldn't watch anything die like that, no matter how strange it looked. I scooped up the smaller one first. It was surprisingly heavy, solid muscle under that fur, and carried it back to the cabin. Its breathing was so shallow I wasn't sure it was still alive. The second one was in better shape, but still hypothermic, its little hands and feet like blocks of ice. Getting them both inside took 2 trips through that killer storm. By the time I had them both by the fireplace, I was exhausted and starting to question my sanity. What had I just brought into my home? They lay there on old blankets, not moving much, ice melting off their fur onto my wooden floor. The smaller one's breathing was getting worse. I'd seen hypothermia before. You have to warm them slowly, or you can stop their heart. I wrapped them in more blankets, moved them closer to the fire, started heating water on the wood stove. The next few hours were touch and go. I gave them tiny sips of warm water, rubbed their hands and feet to get circulation going, kept the fire burning hot. The smaller one scared me. Its breathing got so faint I thought I'd lost it twice. But gradually, slowly, they both started to come around. As they warmed up, I got my first real look at what I'd rescued. They were definitely not human, but not any kind of animal I recognized either. Their faces had an intelligent quality that was unsettling. When they looked at me, it felt like they were actually seeing me, understanding that I was trying to help. Their fur was thick and dark, almost black when it dried. Their hands had opposable thumbs, and their feet were larger than you'd expect, with what looked like permanent calluses on the soles. Most striking were their eyes, dark brown, almost black, but with a depth that seemed eerily human. That first night, they huddled together near the fire, making soft, cooing sounds to each other. It reminded me of how my daughter used to talk to her stuffed animals when she thought nobody was listening. They seemed aware that I'd helped them, but they were still wary. Every time I moved too quickly or made a sudden noise, they'd freeze and watch me carefully. I barely slept that night, kept checking to make sure they were still breathing, still warm enough. Part of me couldn't believe what was happening, part of me was terrified, but mostly I just felt responsible for them now. Whatever they were alive, and they'd been dying when I found them. The next morning brought new challenges. They were definitely feeling better, more alert and active, but they were also hungry. I offered them some jerky and canned meat, thinking they might be carnivores, but they wanted nothing to do with it. They pushed it away and made what sounded like disgusted noises. Trial and error led me to the apples I kept in cold storage. Their eyes lit up when they saw the fruit, and they ate it carefully, almost delicately, taking small bites and chewing thoughtfully. They also liked the frozen vegetables I had, crackers, nuts, and even seemed to enjoy the powdered milk when I mixed it with water. Over the next few days, as the storm continued to rage outside, we settled into an odd routine. They stayed near the fire most of the time, but began exploring the cabin more. They were incredibly curious about everything: my books, the kerosene lamps, the old photographs on the mantle. They'd examine objects carefully, turning them over in their hands, sometimes bringing them to me as if asking what they were for. What struck me most was how clean they were. Despite being wild creatures, they seemed to have an instinct for cleanliness that was almost human. They wouldn't make a mess while eating, and they seemed to understand about using the bucket I set up as a makeshift toilet. It was like they'd been taught manners by someone. Their strength was remarkable. Even though they were small, they could lift things that should have been too heavy for them. One of them moved my wood box like it weighed nothing, then looked at me as if asking if that was helpful. They seemed to want to contribute somehow to earn their keep. The smaller one, the one who had been in worse shape when I found them, was more cautious but incredibly observant. It would watch everything I did with intense focus, like it was memorizing my routines. When I'd stoke the fire, it would hand me pieces of kindling without being asked. When I cooked, it would bring me items from around the cabin that it thought might be useful, though sometimes its choices were puzzling. Once it brought me a boot when I was making soup, presenting it with such pride that I had to pretend it was exactly what I needed. The larger one was bolder, more playful. It discovered that my rocking chair would rock and spent an entire afternoon gently pushing it back and forth, making delighted cooing sounds each time it moved. It also figured out how to open and close my desk drawers and would spend long periods organizing the contents according to some system that made sense only to it. Pencils with pencils, coins with coins, though it seemed fascinated by the different shapes and would arrange them in elaborate patterns. They both loved the warmth of the fire, but they were smart about it. They'd test the air with their hands before getting too close, and they seemed to understand the danger. When I banked the coals at night, they'd watch the process carefully, and I got the impression they were learning, filing away the information for some future use. What amazed me most was their gentleness with my belongings. Despite their strength, they handled everything with careful precision. The smaller one discovered my collection of old photographs on the mantel and would spend hours examining them. It seemed particularly drawn to the pictures of my wife and daughter, holding them delicately and making soft, questioning sounds. When I nodded and said family, it repeated the sound back to me. Not the word exactly, but something close to it in their own language. They communicated with each other constantly through soft grunts, clicks, and gestures. It was clearly a language of some kind, though nothing like anything I'd heard before. Sometimes they'd look at each other and seem to have entire conversations without making a sound, just through hand movements and facial expressions. I started picking up on some of their simpler gestures. Pointing obviously meant, "Look there," but they had subtle hand movements that seemed to indicate agreement, curiosity, caution, or affection. The breakthrough and understanding came when the larger one got its hand stuck in an empty jar I'd left on the counter. It couldn't pull its fist out and was starting to panic, making distressed sounds. I approached slowly, speaking in calm tones, and carefully worked its hand free. The relief on its face was unmistakable, and from that moment on, both of them seemed to understand that I wasn't just sheltering them, I was actively looking out for their welfare. They developed individual relationships with me too. The smaller one would sit near me when I read, sometimes placing its hand on my knee as if checking that I was still there. The larger one was more interactive, bringing me things it found interesting and waiting for my reaction. It discovered that I kept nuts in a tin on the shelf and would point to it when it was hungry, then wait politely for me to get some out rather than just taking them. Sleep became a communal activity. They'd curl up together near the fire, but they always positioned themselves where they could see me. If I got up during the night to tend the fire or use the bathroom, their heads would lift immediately, tracking my movements until I settled back down. It was like having two very attentive, very unusual children. The weather stayed brutal for those first 2 weeks. Even after the initial blizzard ended, temperatures remained dangerously low and more snow kept falling. During one particularly bad night, when the wind was howling so loud it sounded like the mountain was coming apart, both creatures became agitated. They paced by the windows, making anxious sounds, looking out into the darkness. That's when we heard the howling, not when this time, but something alive and hungry. Wolves. I'd heard wolves before up here, but usually just distant calls echoing across the valleys. This was different. This was a pack, and they were close. The howls seemed to come from all around the cabin, and they had a coordination to them that made my blood run cold. My guests heard it too, and their reaction was immediate and terrifying. They rushed to me, pressing close, making frightened, whimpering sounds. The smaller one actually climbed up and clung to my arm like a scared child. Their fear was so intense it was contagious. If these creatures were this afraid, I should be too. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight, checked that the doors were securely barred. The howling continued, seeming to circle the cabin. Through the windows, I could see eyes reflecting in my flashlight beam, multiple pairs moving through the trees around my property. The creatures stayed pressed against me, trembling. Whatever their natural relationship with wolves was, it wasn't good. The larger one kept making soft calling sounds, almost like it was trying to communicate with the pack outside, but the tone was pleading, not aggressive. For 3 hours, those wolves circled my cabin. Every time their howls got closer, my guests would press tighter against me, and I realized I'd become their protector. These powerful, strange beings were looking to me for safety. I made the decision to act when I saw wolf shadows getting too close to my windows. I couldn't just wait and hope they'd go away. I stepped out onto my covered porch, rifle ready, and fired 2 shots into the air. The sound echoed off the mountains like thunder. The howling stopped immediately. For a moment, the silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. Then I heard them moving, padding through the snow, retreating, but not gone. I fired 2 more shots in different directions, making sure they knew I was serious about defending my territory. Gradually, the sounds faded as the pack moved off to find easier prey. But I stayed on that porch for another hour, listening, making sure they were really gone. When I finally came back inside, both creatures rushed to me, touching my hands and arms, making grateful sounds. The smaller one actually hugged my leg, something it had never done before. That night, neither of them slept by the fire. They stayed close to my bed, curled up on the floor where they could see both me and the doors. Every little sound outside would make their heads pop up, alert and ready. I barely slept myself, listening for any sign that the wolves might return. The next morning, I found paw prints all around my cabin. The pack had been larger than I'd thought, maybe 8 or 10 animals, judging by the tracks. They'd definitely been testing my defenses, looking for a way in. The tracks showed they'd spent time at each window, each door, like they were planning an assault. My guests examined the tracks with obvious distress, making anxious sounds and staying close to the cabin walls. It was clear this wasn't their first encounter with wolves. Something about their body language suggested this was an old fear, maybe something that had happened to their kind before. I spent that day reinforcing my defenses, checked all the window latches, made sure my firewood supply was secure inside, cleaned my rifle thoroughly. The creatures watched everything I did, and I could see them learning, understanding that these preparations were about keeping all of us safe. That evening, as if they understood the danger had passed, they were more affectionate than usual. Both of them brought me gifts. The smaller one offered me a smooth stone it had found somewhere, and the larger one presented me with a stick it had carved into an interesting shape using just its teeth and nails. It was crude work, but clearly intentional, clearly meant as a thank you. The wolf encounter changed our relationship. Before that, I was just the human who'd helped them out of a bad situation. After that, I was their protector, their defender. They started following me more closely when I moved around the cabin, like they felt safer when they could see me. The smaller one developed a habit of checking on me throughout the day. It would approach quietly, touch my hand or arm gently, wait for me to acknowledge it, then go back to whatever it was doing. It was like it needed regular confirmation that I was still there, still watching over them. The larger one became more protective of me in return. If I made any sound of discomfort, dropping something on my foot, bumping into furniture, it would rush over to check on me. Once, when I cut my finger while preparing food, it brought me a clean rag without being asked and watched anxiously while I bandaged the wound. They started bringing me things they found around the cabin that they thought might be useful for defense. Pieces of metal, sturdy sticks, even rocks with good throwing weight. They'd present these items solemnly, and I'd accept them with equal gravity, understanding that in their minds they were contributing to our mutual protection. The storm finally broke after 6 days. When I woke up that morning, the silence was almost shocking after nearly a week of constant wind. Sunlight was streaming through the windows for the first time, making the fresh snow outside sparkle like diamonds. I expected my guests to want to leave immediately, to head back into the woods where they belonged, but they showed no interest in going anywhere. When I opened the door to let in some fresh air, they looked outside curiously but didn't make any move to leave. If anything, they seemed content to stay right where they were, warm and safe and well-fed. Days turned into weeks, and we developed a comfortable routine. They'd wake up when I did, help me with simple chores like bringing in firewood or organizing supplies. One of them figured out how to sweep with my broom, though it preferred to use its hands to gather up dust and debris. The other became fascinated with my books, carefully turning pages and studying the pictures, even though it obviously couldn't read. The breakthrough in our relationship came about 3 weeks after I'd found them. I was sitting in my chair reading when the smaller one, the one who'd been in worse shape when I found them, approached slowly. It reached out tentatively and touched my hand, just a gentle brush of fingers. When I didn't pull away, it sat down next to my chair and eventually leaned against my leg. I kept reading, trying not to make a big deal of it, but inside I felt something I hadn't experienced in 12 years. That simple gesture of trust, that willingness to be vulnerable, reminded me what it felt like to be needed by someone, to be responsible for another being's welfare and happiness. Both of them became more affectionate after that. They'd bring me things they found interesting, pretty rocks from outside, icicles that had formed interesting shapes, even dead beetles that they seemed to think were remarkable. They'd present these gifts solemnly, waiting to see my reaction, seeming pleased when I examined their offerings carefully. But after about a month, something changed. They became restless, spending more time looking out the windows toward the forest. They'd make soft calling sounds that carried a note of longing. Sometimes at night, I'd hear them talking to each other in their quiet language, and there was something urgent about their conversations. I started noticing things around the property that hadn't been there before. Large footprints in the snow, much bigger than my guests could have made. Trees that looked like they'd been deliberately bent or arranged. A feeling of being watched when I went outside for firewood. The footprints were enormous, had to be from something at least 8 or 9 feet tall, judging by the stride length. The prints were human-shaped but much wider, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. They circled my cabin at a distance, never coming too close, but clearly investigating. My little guests became increasingly agitated when they saw these signs. They'd chatter excitedly to each other and pace by the windows. It was clear they knew what was making those tracks, and they wanted to respond somehow, but they also seemed torn, looking back and forth between the forest and me like they couldn't decide what to do. The answer came on a clear, cold morning in early March. I woke up and looked out my bedroom window to see 3 massive figures standing at the edge of my yard, just where the forest began. They were unlike anything I'd ever imagined could exist. They had to be 8 or 9 feet tall, powerfully built, covered in dark fur similar to my guests, but much thicker and longer. Their faces were more primitive than the little ones, with heavy brows and pronounced jaws, but their eyes held the same intelligence. They stood perfectly still, watching my cabin, waiting. The moment my guests saw them, they went crazy with excitement. They ran back and forth between the windows, making rapid chattering sounds, clearly wanting to go outside. But they also kept looking at me, as if asking permission or trying to figure out how to say goodbye. I made the decision for them. I opened the front door and stepped back, giving them a clear path outside. They hesitated for just a moment, then ran toward the door. but instead of rushing straight out, they both stopped and looked back at me. The smaller one came back and touched my hand one more time, making a soft sound that seemed like gratitude. Then they were gone, running through the snow toward their family. I watched from my porch as the reunion unfolded. The adult creatures, I assumed they were the parents and maybe an older sibling, examined the little ones carefully, running their hands over their fur, checking for injuries. There was obvious relief in their body language and what looked like joy. Then the largest of the adults, probably the father, turned and looked directly at me. For a moment, we just stared at each other across that snowy yard. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, he approached my porch. I won't lie, I was terrified. This thing could have snapped me in half without effort. But there was nothing threatening in his posture. He moved carefully, almost respectfully, and stopped about 10 feet from my steps. He was carrying something, a large pine branch with unusual cone formations. He placed it gently on my porch, took a step back, and gave what could only be described as a bow. It was clearly a gift, a thank you for taking care of his children. Then, as quietly as they'd appeared, the whole family group turned and walked into the forest. The little ones looked back several times, making soft calling sounds that seemed like goodbye. And then they were gone, swallowed by the deep woods like they'd never existed at all. But they had existed, and that moment changed everything for me. I kept that pine branch on my mantle, and it became a reminder that the world is stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine. But more than that, it reminded me that kindness matters, that taking care of others, even when we don't understand them, is what makes us human. Life went back to its quiet routine after that, but it was different somehow. I no longer felt completely alone up there. Sometimes, usually at dusk or early morning, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the tree line, large shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I was being watched, but not in a threatening way, more like being checked on by distant neighbors. Gifts started appearing around my property, nothing valuable or obviously useful, just interesting things. Perfectly round stones arranged in patterns near my woodshed, sticks carved into unusual shapes and left on my porch steps. Once, I found a collection of bird feathers arranged in a careful spiral by my front door. At first, I thought it might be coincidence, but the gifts were too deliberate, too carefully placed. Someone was leaving them for me, and I had a pretty good idea who. The nightmares that had plagued me for 12 years began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually. For the first time since the accident, I'd been responsible for someone else's welfare, and it had mattered. Those little creatures had needed me, had trusted me, and I hadn't failed them. That spring, I started a small garden beneath my cabin. I told myself it was just for practical reasons. Fresh vegetables would be good for my health. But really, I hoped that if my forest neighbors were still out there, they might enjoy some of what I grew. The garden was regularly raided, but not by deer or rabbits. Someone was carefully selecting the ripest tomatoes, the best apples from my small orchard, the sweetest corn. They took just enough to be noticed, but never so much that it felt like theft, more like sharing. One morning in late summer, I found tiny handprints in the mud around my garden, small prints that matched the size of my former guests. They were growing up, but they still remembered where they'd been safe and cared for. I never saw them clearly again, but I knew they were there. Sometimes on calm evenings, I'd hear their soft calling sounds echoing through the forest. If I called back, just a simple hello spoken into the woods. The sounds would stop for a moment, then resume with what seemed like more energy, like they were answering. The loneliness that had driven me to these mountains began to lift. I wasn't truly alone anymore. I had neighbors, strange as they were. Neighbors who remembered kindness and returned it in their own way. Neighbors who had taught me that family isn't always what you expect it to be. Winter came again, and I found myself hoping they were all staying warm and safe. During the worst storms, I'd leave extra food outside, fruit, vegetables, nuts, just in case they needed it. The food was always gone by morning, though I never saw who took it. On the anniversary of finding those 2 small creatures, I woke up to find something special on my porch. A small woven basket made from pine needles and grass, filled with unusual stones and what looked like hand-carved wooden figures. Crude but clearly deliberate craftsmanship, a family gift. I kept that basket on my kitchen table, and every time I looked at it, I remembered that night in the storm when I'd made the choice to help instead of turning away. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, just bringing 2 freezing creatures inside to warm up. But it had changed everything. The years that followed brought more subtle contacts. I'd find my firewood mysteriously restacked in more efficient piles. Snow would be cleared from my path to the shed after big storms, though I'd never seen anyone doing the work. Once, when I was sick with fever and couldn't get out of bed for 3 days, I woke up to find fresh meat hanging from my porch, cleanly killed and prepared, enough to last a week. I began to understand that I was under a kind of protection. These creatures, this family, had accepted me as part of their extended community. They watched over me the way I'd once watched over their children. It was a relationship unlike anything I'd ever experienced, built on mutual respect and genuine care. The old man who ran the supply depot 8 miles down the mountain sometimes asked me about strange things he had heard in the woods. Unusual calls, trees found bent in impossible ways, footprints too large to belong to any known animal. I'd just shrug and tell him the mountains were full of mysteries. Some things are better left unexplained. But I knew the truth. I was living proof that there are intelligent creatures in our forests that most people will never encounter. Creatures that value family, that remember kindness, that have their own complex society hidden away from human eyes. Creatures that can choose to trust, even across the vast gap between species. People sometimes ask me if I ever get lonely living up here by myself. I tell them no, and I mean it. I'm never truly alone. I have neighbors who check on me, who leave me gifts, who clear my path after storms. They're not human neighbors, but they're family in their own way. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the forest feels particularly alive, I'll step out onto my porch and speak into the trees. I'll thank them for their gifts, tell them about my day, wish them well. I never see them, but I know they're listening. I can feel their presence in the way the forest responds, small movements in the undergrowth, soft sounds that seem like replies. The scared, broken man who came to these mountains 12 years ago is gone. In his place is someone who understands that healing comes from helping others, that purpose can be found in the most unexpected places, and that family extends beyond our own species. I saved 2 small creatures from freezing to death in a blizzard, but in the end, I think they saved me. They gave me back my ability to care about something beyond my own pain. They showed me that even in the darkest storms, there's always a choice to help rather than turn away. And they taught me that the world is far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more connected than most people ever imagine. Every time I hear their calls echoing through the forest, every time I find one of their gifts, every time I sense their protective presence watching over me, I'm reminded that miracles are real. Sometimes they just have fur and walk on 2 legs and know better than to reveal themselves to a world that isn't ready to understand them. But they trusted me, and I prove worthy of that trust. That knowledge sustains me through every storm, every long winter night, every moment when the old loneliness tries to creep back in. I am not alone. I never will be again. And somewhere in the deep woods around my cabin, a family of creatures that shouldn't exist according to science continues to thrive, continues to watch over me, continues to leave small tokens of affection and gratitude. They remember the night I chose compassion over fear, kindness over self-preservation. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. I never thought I'd be telling this story to anyone. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But after what happened to me last October in the backwoods of northern Michigan, I can't keep quiet anymore. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. Maybe they'll understand. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I witnessed out there in the wilderness. I'm a retired Navy veteran, served 2 tours in Vietnam back in the day, seen my share of death and destruction, lost good friends, came home to a wife who helped me heal from all that darkness. We had 2 kids, raised them right, watched them grow up and move away to start their own lives. Then cancer took my wife 3 years ago. Just like that, the woman who'd been my anchor for 42 years was gone. The kids live in California now, got their own families. I see them maybe twice a year if I'm lucky. Christmas and maybe one other visit. It's a lonely life, but I've learned to live with it. The woods became my escape. Always loved camping and fishing, even as a kid. After my wife passed, I started taking longer trips, sometimes a week or 2 at a time. Just me, my gear, and the silence of the forest. It helps clear my head, keeps the memories from eating me alive. Last October, I decided to take one more trip before the holidays started. Halloween was coming up, then Thanksgiving, Christmas. The loneliest time of year for guys like me. Figured I'd head up to the remote areas near the Upper Peninsula, maybe do some canoeing on the rivers up there. Brought my old aluminum canoe, my camping gear, and my rifle. Always bring the rifle. You never know what kind of animals you might run into. The weather was perfect that first week, cool but not freezing, clear skies. I found a good spot about 15 miles from the nearest road, set up camp by a small clearing. There was a river about half a mile through the trees, perfect for water and fishing. I'd been there before, knew the area pretty well. First few days went just like always. Woke up at sunrise, made coffee over the fire, spent the day hiking or fishing. Evenings by the fire, reading an old paperback or just staring at the stars. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But things started getting weird on the 4th day. I was running low on water, so I grabbed my canteen and headed down to the river. It was mid-afternoon, sun filtering through the trees. I knew the path by heart. Follow the game trail for about 10 minutes, then head downhill toward the sound of running water. I was maybe 50 yards from the river when I saw it. At first I thought it was a bear, big dark shape standing near the water's edge. But then it straightened up and I realized it was standing on 2 legs, not like a bear rearing up. This thing was just standing there like a person. But it wasn't a person, it was huge. Had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Covered head to toe in dark brown fur, shoulders broader than any man I'd ever seen, arms longer than they should be. It was just standing there by the water, completely still. Then it saw me. Our eyes met across that distance, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Vietnam, pure animal fear. This thing was looking at me like it was deciding whether I was a threat or prey. For maybe 2 seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it moved. Never seen anything that big move so fast. 1 second, it was by the river. The next, it was crashing through the underbrush, disappearing into the forest. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, then nothing. Complete silence. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking as I filled my canteen, kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those eyes watching me from the tree line. Back at camp, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear after all. Maybe the light was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. That thing was walking upright like a man, but it was no man. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound had me reaching for my rifle. Wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. Owls hooting sounded like calls between predators. I dozed fitfully, waking up every hour or so to check the perimeter of my camp. Around 3 a.m, I woke up to complete silence. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know there's always some kind of noise. Insects buzzing, small animals moving around, wind in the leaves. But right then, there was nothing. Dead silence, like the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I knew I was being watched. I didn't move, didn't even open my eyes all the way. Just lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. My rifle was propped against the tree right next to me. I slowly moved my hand toward it. The feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl, like when you're in enemy territory and you know there's a sniper out there, but you can't see him. That same cold dread in your gut. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, the normal forest sounds started up again. Insects, small animals moving around. Whatever had been watching me was gone. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Next morning, I should have packed up and left. Should have trusted my instincts and gotten out of there. But curiosity killed the cat, as they say. I kept thinking about what I'd seen. Was it real? Was there really something that big living out here in the wilderness? I decided to go back to the river. This time, I brought my rifle and approached from downstream. Found a good hiding spot in some thick bushes where I could watch the area without being seen. Settled in and waited. Nothing happened for the first few hours. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing when I heard them coming. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the forest. But not just one set, at least 2, maybe 3. They were coming from upstream following the river. I ducked lower in the bushes and tried to control my breathing. Through the leaves, I could see the spot where I'd first seen the creature yesterday. Then they appeared. 2 of them, both massive, both walking upright like humans, but clearly not human. The first one was the same dark brown I'd seen before. The second was lighter, almost reddish in the sunlight. They moved with purpose, like they owned this stretch of river. And maybe they did. I watched them for almost an hour. They caught fish like nothing I'd ever seen, just reached into the water and grabbed them with their bare hands. No nets, no tools. Their reflexes were incredible, faster than any human could manage. They caught enough fish for a whole family in minutes. The way they moved was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. In the water, they were graceful as dancers despite their massive size. The darker one would stand perfectly still in the current, then strike like lightning when a fish passed by. Never missed, not once. When they drank from the river, they cupped the water in their hands just like people would. When they communicated, it was with low grunts and hand gestures. Almost human, but not quite. The sounds they made weren't random animal noises. There was a pattern to them, a rhythm that suggested language. At one point, the lighter-colored one found something in the water. Looked like a piece of metal, maybe part of an old fishing lure. It held the object up to show the other one, turning it over in its hands like it was examining every detail. They both looked at it for a long time, making quiet clicking sounds to each other. Then the darker one took it and threw it far downstream, like they didn't want any trace of human presence in their territory. The strangest part was how intelligent they seemed. They weren't just animals following instinct. They were thinking, planning, communicating. At one point, the darker one pointed downstream and made some kind of noise to the other. They had what looked like a conversation, back and forth sounds, gestures, even what looked like disagreement. The lighter one shook its head several times before finally nodding. I realized I was watching something that wasn't supposed to exist. These creatures had their own society, their own way of doing things. They were organized, maybe even more organized than some human communities I'd seen. After they finished fishing, they did something that really threw me. They cleaned up after themselves, picked up the fish bones and scales, even smoothed out the mud where they'd been standing. Left the riverbank looking almost exactly like it had before they arrived, like they were trying to hide any evidence they'd been there. Then they did something else that made my blood run cold. The darker one looked directly at my hiding spot and made a low sound to the other. Not aggressive, more like a warning. They knew I was there, had probably known the whole time, but instead of confronting me or running away, they just gathered their fish and walked back into the forest like nothing had happened. Like they decided I wasn't worth worrying about. I stayed hidden for another 2 hours after they left, too scared to move. My legs were cramped from crouching in the bushes, but I didn't dare stand up. What if there were more of them? What if they'd left one behind to watch me? When I finally worked up the courage to leave my hiding spot, I crept down to the riverbank where they'd been fishing. I had to see for myself, had to find some proof that what I'd witnessed was real. The ground was still damp where they'd stood, and I could make out the faint impressions of their feet in the mud. The prints were enormous, had to be 18, maybe 20 inches long, wider than any human foot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. I tried to measure one with my own boot. My size 11 looked like a child's shoe next to those prints. Whatever these things were, they were built for power, built to survive in the wilderness better than any human ever could. There were other signs too. Broken branches at about 8 feet high, way higher than any human could reach without climbing. Scratches on tree bark that looked fresh. And a smell, musky, wild, like wet animal fur, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I took pictures with my old digital camera, though I knew they probably wouldn't come out clear. The lighting was bad and my hands were shaking too much to hold the camera steady, but I had to try to document what I'd found. As I was taking the last picture, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps in the forest behind me, heavy and deliberate. Someone or something was coming back. I grabbed my camera and ran. Didn't look back, didn't try to see what was following me. Just crashed through the underbrush toward my camp as fast as my old legs could carry me. Behind me, I could hear those footsteps keeping pace. Not running, just walking with those long strides that could probably cover twice the distance of my panicked scrambling. Whatever was back there wasn't in a hurry. It knew these woods better than I did, knew I couldn't really escape. I made it back to my camp and immediately started checking my gear, rifle loaded and ready. Campfire built up high so I'd have light if something came calling after dark. Extra firewood stacked within arm's reach. But nothing happened that evening. No visitors, no sounds of movement in the forest around me. Just a normal night in the woods, except for the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling I was still being watched. I tried to eat dinner, but my appetite was gone. Tried to read, but couldn't concentrate on the words. Every little sound had me reaching for my rifle. Wind in the trees sounded like breathing. Branches creaking sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, I heard them calling to each other. Low, haunting sounds echoing through the forest from different directions. One call, then an answer from somewhere else. Then another answer from a third location. They were spread out all around me, maybe a mile or more apart, but they were definitely communicating. The calls went on for about an hour. Sometimes close enough to make my tent shake with the sound, sometimes so distant I could barely hear them. but always there, always reminding me that I was surrounded. I didn't sleep at all that night. Dawn came slowly, and with it, a decision. I should pack up and leave, should head home and forget this whole thing ever happened. But something kept me from breaking camp. Maybe it was stubbornness. I'd planned a week-long trip and I didn't want to cut it short. Maybe it was curiosity. I'd seen something incredible and part of me wanted to see more. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe after all these years of being alone, of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, I'd finally found something that made me feel alive again. Even if that something was terrifying. I decided to stay one more day. The morning passed quietly. I cooked breakfast, cleaned my gear, tried to act like everything was normal. But I kept the rifle close, and I made sure to stay within sight of my camp at all times. Around noon, I found their trail. It was about 100 yards from my camp, a path through the trees that I'd somehow missed before. The undergrowth was trampled down, branches broken at shoulder height for something much taller than me. This wasn't a deer trail or a bear path. This was something else entirely. I followed it for about half a mile before I lost my nerve. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from the river, toward a part of the woods I'd never explored. The trees got thicker, the shadows darker. It felt like I was walking into their territory, their home ground. And that's when I realized I wasn't just being curious anymore, I was being stupid. These creatures, whatever they were, had tolerated my presence so far. But if I started following their trails, poking around their territory, that tolerance might not last much longer. I turned around and headed back to camp, but I couldn't stop thinking about what might be at the end of that trail. Where did they live? How many of them were there? Did they have families, children, some kind of community deeper in the forest? The questions ate at me all afternoon. I stayed hidden until the sun started going down. They'd left hours earlier, disappearing back into the forest the same way they'd come. As darkness fell, I knew I had to get back to my camp. That's when I made my second mistake. I should have stayed put until morning, should have waited for daylight. But I was worried about leaving my gear unattended for too long, and I thought I knew these woods well enough to navigate in the dark. I was wrong. I'd made it maybe a quarter of the way back when I heard the first branch snap. Off to my right, maybe 50 yards away. Could have been a deer, could have been anything. But something in my gut told me it wasn't. I stopped and listened. The forest had gone quiet again. That same unnatural silence I was starting to recognize as a warning sign. No insects, no small animals, no wind in the trees. Just dead calm, like everything was holding its breath. I started walking again, faster now. My flashlight beam danced across the trees ahead of me, creating moving shadows that looked like figures lurking just out of sight. Every fallen log looked like a crouching shape. Every low branch looked like an outstretched arm. Then I heard it again, another branch breaking, this time from my left. Whatever was out there had changed position, moved to flank me. My military training kicked in. When you're being stalked by an enemy, never travel in a straight line. I changed direction, angling more toward the north, hoping to throw off whatever was following me. But it didn't work. A few minutes later, I heard movement ahead of me. Something big crashing through the underbrush, then stopping suddenly when I stopped. I was being herded, pushed away from my planned route back to camp. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped my rifle tighter. This felt different from the encounter at the river. This felt like a hunt. I tried to get my bearings, figure out exactly where I was. The stars were mostly blocked by the tree canopy, and in my panic, I'd lost track of which direction I was heading. The river should be somewhere to my south, my camp somewhere to the north. But in the darkness, surrounded by trees that all looked the same, I wasn't certain of anything. That's when I saw the first set of eyes. 2 points of light reflecting my flashlight beam about chest high, maybe 30 yards away. I swung the light toward them, but whatever it was ducked behind a tree before I could get a good look. Then I saw another pair of eyes off to my left, then another to my right. They had me surrounded. I backed up against a large oak tree, trying to keep all of them in my field of view. But there were too many spread out in too wide a circle. I couldn't watch them all at once. "I know you're there," I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "I'm not here to hurt anybody. Just let me go back to my camp." The words sounded stupid as soon as I said them, like these creatures would understand English, like they cared about my intentions. But something strange happened. The eyes stopped moving. The forest went completely still. It was like they were listening, trying to understand what I'd said. Then one of them stepped into my flashlight beam. It was the lighter colored one from the river. Same massive frame, same intelligent eyes. But up close, in the harsh light of my flashlight, I could see details that made my blood run cold. Its face was more human than ape, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite explain. The proportions were off. Eyes too deep, jaw too wide, forehead sloping back at an impossible angle. When it opened its mouth, I could see teeth that were definitely not human. Too sharp, too many of them. It made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a word, something in between. Then it tilted its head and made the sound again, like it was asking a question. I realized it was trying to communicate with me. "I don't understand," I whispered. "I don't know what you want." The creature took another step forward, close enough now that I could smell it. That same musky scent I'd noticed at the river, but stronger. Close enough that I could see its chest rising and falling with each breath. It raised one massive hand and pointed behind me, back the way I'd come. Then it made that questioning sound again. It was asking why I'd been following their trail, why I'd been spying on them at the river. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing if it could understand me, but hoping my tone would convey what words couldn't. "I was just curious. I didn't mean any harm." The creature studied me for a long moment. Then it made a different sound, longer, more complex. Almost immediately, I heard answering calls from the darkness around me. The other sets of eyes started moving again, but not toward me. They were pulling back, disappearing into the forest. The creature in front of me made one final sound, lower and more urgent, a warning. Then it too stepped back into the darkness, leaving me alone with my flashlight and my racing heart. But I wasn't really alone. I could still feel them out there, watching from the shadows, making sure I went where they wanted me to go. I started walking again, following what I hoped was the path back to my camp. Behind me, I could hear soft footsteps in the leaves, not threatening, just present. Like they were escorting me, making sure I actually left their territory. It took me another hour to find my camp, an hour of stumbling through the dark woods with the constant sensation of being watched. When I finally saw my campfire flickering through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I turned around one last time before entering my camp. In the glow from my fire, I could just make out several large shapes standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me, making sure I stayed put. I built up my fire as high as I could and sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap. They stayed there for most of the night, those silent watchers in the darkness. I could see their eyes reflecting the firelight, never moving, never making a sound. Around 3 a.m, they finally disappeared. I should have packed up right then and there, should have thrown everything in my truck and driven straight home. But I was exhausted, too tired to think straight. I convinced myself I'd be safe until morning. Convinced myself they'd delivered their message and would leave me alone now. I was wrong about that too. Halfway back to camp, that unnatural silence fell over the forest again. Every bird, every insect, every small animal went quiet at the same time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. Then I heard it, a single branch snapping somewhere off to my left. Not the kind of sound a deer or rabbit makes. Something big had stepped on that branch. I unslung my rifle and flicked off the safety. The familiar weight of the weapon in my hands calmed my nerves a little. In Vietnam, my rifle had kept me alive more times than I could count. Maybe it would do the same here. But this wasn't Vietnam. This was something else entirely. I started moving again, slower now, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen. Twice more, I heard branches breaking, always from different directions. Whatever was out there was following me, maybe even circling me. The beam of my flashlight only reached about 30 feet, creating a small circle of visibility in an ocean of darkness. Beyond that circle, anything could be lurking. Anything could be watching me stumble through their territory like a lost child. I tried to remember my training from the Navy, how to move quietly in hostile territory, how to use cover effectively, how to spot an ambush before walking into it. But that training had been for fighting other humans, not whatever these things were. Another sound, this time from directly ahead, something moving through the underbrush with deliberate steps. I raised my rifle and swept the flashlight beam back and forth, trying to spot movement in the trees. Nothing, just shadows and darkness. But I knew it was there, could feel it watching me, evaluating me, deciding what to do about the intruder in its domain. My camp was only a few hundred yards away when I saw it. A massive shape standing between two trees directly in my path. Just standing there, motionless, like it was waiting for me. I raised my rifle and looked through the scope. Even in the dim light, I could make out details I wished I couldn't see. This was the same creature I'd seen at the river, the dark brown one. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I'd imagined. Its face was almost human, but not quite. Broad features, deep-set eyes that reflected what little light there was. When it saw me raise the rifle, it tilted its head slightly, like it was curious about what I was holding. Then it growled, not like any animal I'd ever heard, deep, rumbling, coming from somewhere in its chest. The sound made my teeth ache and my hands shake. This thing was warning me, telling me I didn't belong here. It started walking toward me. Each step was deliberate, confident. This creature wasn't afraid of me or my rifle. It probably didn't even know what a rifle was. I kept the scope trained on its chest, finger on the trigger, but I didn't want to shoot. Something about the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, it felt wrong to just gun it down. When it was about 20 yards away, it stopped. We stared at each other across that short distance. I could see its chest rising and falling with each breath, could see the individual hairs in its fur moving in the night breeze. Then it did something I didn't expect. It stepped behind a large oak tree, disappearing from view. For a moment, I thought maybe it had decided to leave me alone. Maybe we could both just walk away from this encounter. I was wrong again. The rock came out of nowhere. Something the size of a bowling ball came flying through the air, straight at my head. I threw myself to the side, hit the ground hard, felt the rock whistle past my ear, and crash into the tree behind me. I rolled, came up with the rifle, and fired without thinking. The muzzle flash lit up the forest for a split second. In that brief moment of light, I saw the creature stumbling backward, clutching its right arm. Dark liquid, blood, was already starting to flow between its fingers. It let out a howl that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Pure pain and rage echoing through the trees. Other howls answered from deeper in the forest. I'd hurt one of them, and now the others knew. The wounded creature looked at me one more time. Even injured, even bleeding, there was no fear in its eyes, only anger. And something else. Disappointment, maybe. Like I'd broken some kind of trust. Then it turned and vanished into the darkness. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I ran back to my camp, threw my gear into my pack as fast as I could, and grabbed my canoe. The whole time, I could hear movement in the forest around me, branches breaking, leaves rustling, but I couldn't see anything. They were out there watching me pack up and leave. I could feel their eyes on me. The river was my only way out. The nearest road was 15 miles through thick forest, but the river would take me downstream to a small village only about 8 miles away. In my canoe, I could make that distance in a couple hours, even in the dark. I dragged the canoe through the trees toward the water, my rifle slung across my back, pack weighing me down. Every shadow looked like one of those creatures. Every sound made me jump. When I reached the riverbank, I could hear them, movement all around me in the darkness. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping, low grunts and calls. They were surrounding me, but staying just out of sight. I threw the canoe into the water and jumped in, paddle in one hand, rifle in the other. That's when I saw them. As I pushed off from the shore, they started appearing along the riverbank. First one, then another, then more. I counted at least 6, maybe 8, all different sizes, different shades of brown and gray. A whole family maybe, or a tribe. Some of them were holding rocks, big ones they could easily throw at me. I was sitting duck in that canoe, nowhere to hide if they decided to attack. But they didn't throw the rocks. They just watched me paddle downstream, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like cat's eyes, following my progress along the bank but not attacking. Even after I'd shot one of them, they were letting me go. I couldn't understand it then, and I still can't understand it now. Maybe they recognized that I wasn't really a threat. Maybe they understood that I'd only shot in self-defense when their friend threw that rock at me. Maybe they had some kind of code about not killing unless absolutely necessary. Or maybe they just wanted me gone. And the easiest way to make that happen was to let me leave on my own. I paddled hard downstream, constantly looking over my shoulder. They followed me along the bank for almost a mile before disappearing back into the forest. The last one I saw was standing on a fallen log that extended out over the water, just watching me paddle away into the darkness. I made it to the village just after midnight, pulled my canoe up on the boat ramp, and sat there shaking for a good 10 minutes before I could trust my legs to carry me to my truck. Drove straight home without stopping. Didn't sleep for 3 days. I've been back to those woods since then. Not to the same spot, I'll never go back there, but to other areas nearby. Haven't seen any signs of them. No footprints, no broken branches arranged in strange patterns, no feeling of being watched. Maybe they moved on to a different territory. Maybe they were never really there at all, and I just had some kind of breakdown after being alone in the woods for too long. Wouldn't be the first veteran to have his mind play tricks on him. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. Those creatures were real, and they were intelligent. They had families, territories, their own way of communicating. They've probably been living in those forests for generations, maybe centuries, staying hidden from people like us. I think about that wounded one sometimes, wonder if it survived, if its arm healed properly. Wonder if it tells the others about the strange human who shot it and then ran away. Wonder if they remember me as a threat or just as another scared animal that wandered into their territory by mistake. The strangest part is that I don't think they wanted to hurt me. Even after I shot one of them, they let me go. They could have killed me easily, thrown rocks, attacked me in the water when I was defenseless. But they didn't. Maybe they understood that I was scared. Maybe they recognized something in me that reminded them of themselves. Just another creature trying to survive in a world that didn't always make sense. I've thought about reporting what I saw. There are groups that study this kind of thing, researchers who might be interested. But what would be the point? Even if they believe me, even if they sent teams to look for evidence, those creatures are long gone by now. They're too smart to stick around after an encounter like that. Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled things differently. Maybe if I'd approached them peacefully, tried to communicate somehow, they would have accepted me. Maybe I could have learned something about them, about how they live, what they need to survive. But I was scared and alone and faced with something I didn't understand. I reacted the way I'd been trained to react in Vietnam: identify the threat and eliminate it. Shoot first, ask questions later. That training kept me alive in the war, but maybe it wasn't the right response to those creatures. Maybe they weren't a threat at all, just a family trying to live their lives in peace. I still go camping, but I stay closer to civilization now. State parks, campgrounds with other people around. I tell myself it's because I'm getting older, that I don't want to take risks like I used to. But the truth is, I'm afraid of running into them again. Not because I think they'll hurt me. I actually don't think they would. I'm afraid because I don't know how I'd react. Would I run again? Would I try to shoot them? Would I finally try to make peaceful contact? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. People ask me sometimes if I believe in Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call them. I used to say, no, of course not. That's just stories and hoaxes and people seeing what they want to see. Now I just change the subject because I know they're out there. I've seen them, shot one of them, looked into their eyes, and saw intelligence staring back at me. They're real, they're smart, and they want to be left alone. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things are meant to stay hidden, to live their lives without interference from us. Maybe the fact that they've managed to stay secret for so long proves that they're better at surviving than we give them credit for. I keep my rifle clean and ready just in case, not because I want to use it, but because it makes me feel safer when I'm out in the woods. It's a reminder that I survived my encounter with them once, and maybe I could survive another one if it ever came to that. But mostly, I hope it never comes to that. I hope they found a new territory, far away from hiking trails and camping spots and curious humans like me. I hope they're raising their young and teaching them to stay hidden, to avoid contact with our kind. And I hope that wounded one I shot learned to forgive me for being afraid. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that moment when we first saw each other by the river. Two different species, both just trying to live our lives, both startled by an unexpected encounter. For those few seconds, there was no fear, no aggression, no violence, just recognition, one thinking being acknowledging another. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for in this world, a moment of understanding before fear and instinct take over. I shot Bigfoot, and I've regretted it every day since. Not because I think I did the wrong thing, I was defending myself against what I perceived as a threat, but because I wonder what might have happened if I'd found the courage to lower my rifle instead of raising it. Guess I'll never know now, but I'll never forget those eyes, that intelligence, that moment of recognition between two very different kinds of beings sharing the same small piece of wilderness. They're out there, somewhere, and they're probably better off staying hidden from people like me. People who react with fear instead of wonder, with violence instead of curiosity. Maybe someday someone else will have a chance to do better than I did, to meet them with open hands instead of raised weapons, with questions instead of bullets. I hope so. Because if there's one thing I learned from my encounter, it's that we're not alone on this planet. There are other intelligent beings sharing this world with us, and maybe it's time we started acting like we deserve their respect instead of their fear. But that's a lesson I learned too late to do any good. All I can do now is tell my story and hope that someone else might learn from my mistakes. If you're ever out there in the deep woods and you see something that shouldn't exist, something impossible and magnificent and terrifying all at the same time, maybe think twice before reaching for your weapon. Maybe try reaching out your hand instead. You might be surprised by what reaches back. For more interesting stories, check this out.